Good evening. It is Wednesday, July 12th, 2017, 7:01 p.m. This is the Evanston Plan Commission. I am Jim Ford. We have a quorum. I will call the meeting to order. You have the agenda in front of you. I'm going to suggest a change to the agenda. Since we have some of the consultants here, we have two issues in front of us, two text amendments, one on the front yard question, which we dealt with at or began to deal with at our last meeting, and the other, the parking requirements for the TOD areas. Since we have consultants here on the TOD question, I would suggest that we address that one first so that we don't keep them any longer than we have to. And then we can come back and deal with the front yard issue. So if there's no objection, we'll change the agenda in that way. Are there any other changes or additions to the agenda? Hearing none, it will stand as revised. You have the minutes of our meeting of May 10th, 2017, still within human memory. Are there corrections or additions to the minutes? Hearing none, is there a motion to approve?
Motion approved.
Belisle, seconded. Goddard. All in favor?
Sorry.
Approved. Thank you. All right. Then case number 16, PLND 0068, a proposed zoning ordinance text amendment to reduce the parking requirements for residential units in TOD areas. There being no public, I'm not going to go through the formal script on our proceedings. This is a public hearing. Our action on this will take the form of a recommendation to City Council, which is the determining body on amendments to the zoning ordinance. The staff are the petitioners in this case, so I will ask whoever's going to do the summary to present a brief summary of the case. Then we're going to invite the consultants to do a presentation, or are you going to do the presentation, or are they simply going to ask questions? Not simply, but answer questions. How do you want to do it?
I have a short presentation, and then if there are any questions for staff or the consultants, we can
Okay.
do it that way.
Fine. In which case, let's proceed.
Right.
Just let me make one comment, though. I think this is a really important issue. And I'm not of a mind to rush through it. Staff and I have talked and are agreed that it is not urgent that we finish it tonight. If we can, that's fine. But if we discover we need more information, if we need clarification on things, if we want some revisions to the proposal, I think we should feel free to continue this over to the August meeting. So if we can get done, fine, but I'm not going to insist that we rush through it. Okay, Ms. Jones.
All right. Let me go down to the item here. Okay, well, to give a little bit of background on how we got here, in 2015, the city received a grant from the Regional Transit Authority, or RTA, through their community planning program in order to examine our existing parking regulations in the Metro and CTA transit-served areas. So this initial consultant team consisted of Sam Schwartz Engineering, Duncan Associates, and Center for Neighborhood Technology, or CNT. As a quick overview, we have about 8 different TOD areas, and that consists of 11 different actual transit stops. There are several locations where there are actually 2, either the CTA and Metro, either at the same station or in close proximity. So the study consisted of an analysis of the city's existing parking regulations, data that was collected from our city parking garages regarding the utilization, parking data from our recent planned developments, as well as a comparison of our peer cities. And through the analysis, the study found that our current parking regulations are well served for areas that are away from our transit stops, but could lead to underutilization of parking within our TOD areas. Also, with the recently approved planned developments that we have seen coming in, there have been a number of variances that have been granted with regards to the required amount of parking. And in many of these projects, they either have adequate parking or still underutilized parking. So some of the major recommendations within this study consisted of short-term projects and a long-term project. The short-term projects essentially were, recommendations rather, were to modify the parking requirements based on the number of bedrooms in a unit to 0.55 per bedroom, or as an alternative to that, implementing a base parking requirement that is one parking space per unit, regardless of the size of the unit or the number of bedrooms within that unit. Also, a recommendation was to allow developers to propose further reductions on a case-by-case basis, basically through our variation process. But this would need to be supported by parking studies, market research, and transportation demand management strategies or programs. We'd also require a multimodal transportation study for all developments within a TOD. We could require all developments that are granted a variance to provide vehicle ownership data to the city on an annual basis, and this would be perhaps over like a 5 to 7 year period. We would, for developments that are significantly larger, basically our planned development units that are over 100 units, that request a parking variance, we would need to have that transit demand management plan provided. Also, a recommendation was to encourage shared parking approaches to further reduce the residential parking requirements for our mixed-use developments, and consider establishing and implementing an impact fee or escrow payments or some kind of fee in lieu of parking policy for incoming development reviews and proposed construction processes or projects. A more long-term project would be to conduct a comprehensive parking study of our off-street facilities, both public and private, to determine the future parking needs within our key TOD areas and the availability of the supply. So before I get into the current proposal, I will give a little bit more background. We did bring this study to the Transportation and Parking Committee back in August of 2016. So they saw a lot of the initial recommendations. They did also bring up some concerns and some requests for additional information, which have actually been provided in the current study. And what was brought to the committee at that time was the one parking space per dwelling unit recommendation. With the updates and the additional information that we were able to gather, we have come up with the following proposal that would be the 0.55 parking spaces per bedroom that's provided. So for studios or one bedroom, that would be 0.55 parking spaces per bedroom. If we jump to 2 bedrooms, that would be 1.1 parking spaces per unit. And if you jump up to the 3-bedroom units, that would end up being 1.65 parking spaces. So as you can see there. This would not affect the single-family or the 2-family dwelling units. Those would stay as is. Additionally, we would keep the existing inclusionary housing ordinance parking incentives the same. There'd be no change to those. So with that, very quick overview. If you have any questions?
Just one question on process or outcome. Do you want us only to comment on the proposed text amendment, and we do not have language for the text amendment? All we've got is, I guess, this substance. Or do you want comments from us on the other recommendations as well?
I think first and foremost, the text amendment that is before you, but also we would like to have some additional feedback on some of the other recommendations so we can move forward on some of those in the future as well.
Okay, thank you. All right, questions? Somebody's light is on.
That's me. Yeah, it's me.
Commissioner Goddard,
I wondered if you could translate.
you were on.
I'm on.
I think your mic's off. There you go.
I wonder if you could translate this one, I can't even find it now. For developments over 100 units, that paragraph, what exactly are you saying here? These are the study recommendations. It's the third from the end.
Oh, so
For the
basically,
TDM.
yeah, for developments which would essentially end up being our planned developments, if they are proposing to provide over 100 or more dwelling units, then we would require a transit demand management plan if they want to request a parking variance. Or
What do you mean by
essentially-
transit demand?
Basically, that would be a plan that addresses the various means of transportation and essentially what the demand for them.
For the, in that building?
Right,
or-
what their proposed.
Okay.
This would be. We've got consultants
And
as well.
for a fuller answer,
Yes.
Sure, I can contribute. We do a lot of...
I'm sorry,
Oh,
you
Kelly
are,
Connolly with Sam Schwartz Engineering,
Okay.
303 West Erie in Chicago. I worked on this study and just wanted to add a little bit to what Megan said about TDM plans, transportation demand management plans. Typically what you would see is the developer that was building the residential tower, they come in with a plan that includes things that incentivize their residents to not own cars. Things like accommodating subsidized CTA passes, contributing to a divvy station out front, having indoor bike parking, unbundling parking costs so that if you don't have a car, you don't have to be paying for that space, things like that.
I guess, is there anything in there that we haven't already been asking as a matter of routine in large projects? I mean, granted, it hasn't come to us in the form of a TDM, but it seems to me, when I look at the public benefits that people have been asked to provide, this is exactly what we've been getting. Our car share spaces, divvy spaces, transit passes. Is there something more that we would get out of this?
We actually have in practice been strongly suggesting and requesting that we have things like the divvy contribution and car share spaces and bike parking. And really a lot of the proposed developments that we see have proposed this without us requesting them. This would essentially have a more concrete plan for the things that they are providing instead of just kind of an ad hoc public benefit, which is kind of what it is now.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Okay. Terry?
It seems to me that a big difference is use of the word incentive, where usually the developer presents to us, we're going to do this, we're going to have divvy stations, and in this case, it sounds like we would ask the developers to present that as part of their sales pitch for rental or ownership, and that we would ask them to do that. Is that a fair distinction?
Yeah, I think our view in making that recommendation is that, yes, you're sort of codifying that, and they know in advance and coming to you that they're going to have to be supplying you some sort of TDM plan.
There wouldn't really be a way, though, to keep track of whether they're actually doing that for their renters. I mean, this would be part of the sales pitch, that, we're close to this, that, and the other. That's why we don't need to provide parking space. Maybe I'm splitting hairs here, but you do come to us and say, this is the reason why we can decrease the number of parking spaces for this zone. But again, this sounds like it's also a matter of pitching it to prospective tenants, which there's no way to follow up on.
That is a good point. In many cases, we do some follow-up with regards to requesting information with regards to like parking utilization and making sure that passes have been requested or car share spaces have actually been found and put in place. We could possibly have some language or maybe some additional follow-up with regards to making sure that a developer has purchased transit passes for their residents or something like that, if that's something that we see a need for.
Mr. Mangum?
Yes, good evening, Mr. Chair, members of the Plan Commission. Just to add on that, these developments of 100 units or larger would be plan developments. So as part of the ordinance approving the plan development, there's the ability to put in conditions of approval, and that's something that we've been doing. So that can require some of these things. We've required developers to provide proof of the divvy passes purchases before getting occupancy for the building, for example.
I'm speaking more of what they say about their units that to the prospective tenants. I know we always are presented with their plans and this many divvy stations and that many car share spaces, but that's if you want to attract people who don't want to have a lot of cars, or I would think that the developers would have to, that we would have to make it clear to the developers that that's what we want. We want you to tell your prospective tenants, it should be part of your rental literature, that we have this available and that available. I mean, that's, instead of having people move up here with 2 cars and then say, well, I'll just park in the neighborhood. I mean, people will do that anyway, but not to the Plan Commission, but to the tenants.
You could include that as a condition as part of the definition of the TDM plan, couldn't you?
I think we could. As far as what materials they give the tenants, that'd be a little more difficult to enforce, but certainly requiring, 1 year of car share membership is something that we've done, requiring 1 year divvy membership, so that those are benefits that they're providing to those tenants that live in the building, and then that would incentivize them to not have vehicles.
And I suppose the question is whether it would be silly of them not to announce that. I don't know. Commissioner Belisle?
I think actually Commissioner Isaac had raised his light as Commissioner Dubin was talking, and I want to take us on a different direction. So if he has something to comment on it, I'll leave
That's
my spot.
Yeah. I just want to make sure I'm framing this in my head correctly. So if a developer comes in and they're developing less than 100 units, in order to get a variance on the lower parking requirements, the TOD areas that we're proposing today, they would not have to have they would not be required to come in with any kind of parking study. They wouldn't have to come in with a parking study. For developments over 100 units, they'd have to come in with a parking study with this report as a precondition to us even considering the request for a variance. And to the extent that the developer, either in a development of more or less than 100 units, if they're willing to follow what's in the ordinance, they wouldn't be required to have any kind of divvy stations or car share or whatever, right? Like, we're sort of codifying that if they're going to follow the parking requirements, these lower parking requirements, we're not going to be asking for those kinds of benefits. Is that an accurate statement?
Oh, essentially, and if a development happens to want to provide the proper amount of parking, that would be great, and we wouldn't need to require this additional TDM plan or anything above that. But we still, given that a 90-unit building would still be a very large development, we'd still probably need to have that parking study or the traffic circulation study as well.
Is that what this is? Is that what this is saying? Oh, I mean, so the recommendation is that it only be required for developments of 100 or more.
Right,
So-
that's what this is addressing,
Okay.
yeah.
So,
Are we making it more difficult here to ask, if we have a developer who comes in with 90 units and meets the .55 standard, are we making it more difficult for us to ask for public benefits like divvy spaces? Is that your
I think
concern?
I think that's sort of out the window then, right? I mean, if they're going to comply with the parking requirements, then unless you were able to tie it to some other aspect of the development, I think you're saying you're complying with the parking requirements. You don't have to have a divvy station, more bike parking inside your building, other benefits that we would consider as a substitute for the lower parking ratio that they are asking for.
I think with the recommendation, it's more so dealing with having these be a requirement versus a strong suggestion or something that would be seen as more favorable for the project to be approved. I mean, as we review projects now, there is usually some dialogue back and forth with regards to public benefits, and that would probably still occur. This isn't to say that if we come across a 90-unit building that we wouldn't still suggest that and see if that's a possibility or if the developer would be open to that. But for the purposes of this, they wouldn't be required to have a TDM plan.
At that size, they're still probably a PUD. So they're still subject to the public benefit requirements.
Right.
And we can ask requirements that would be in the TDM plan. We're just not asking for the plan. Yes?
Yes.
Now, Commissioner Belisle.
Thank you. Maybe first the question on the study itself. When you were mentioning that parking was underutilized, is it because we have buildings that are full of people that don't have a car, or is it because the buildings are not full themselves?
In the majority of the cases, it's the buildings are have residents that don't have as many vehicles. There are cases where a building may not be full, especially if it's a newer building, so that kind of lends to underutilization of the parking. And an example that I used in the memo for the E2 development, they are, I want to say at the time of their particular study, they were 94% occupied, but the maximum utilization of the parking that they saw was under 50%. So that's kind of what that's referring to.
But the data that we have, that I think you got from the Secretary of State on vehicle ownership, wouldn't differ whether buildings were fully occupied or half occupied, would they? You've still got a given population and a given number of cars within those census tracts, yes?
Yes, but I
Say yes.
Well, we actually related that to number of bedrooms. So it would not be reflective of necessarily of, however, we broke it down by the actual address. So you can look at individual buildings and determine if that particular building is lower occupancy or not, and decide from a building case-by-case standpoint if that building is occupied. But we didn't relate it to the population. We related it to the number of units and the number of bedrooms.
So, wait a minute. You've got data from CNT and I quote, "Across Evanston, the typical household owns 1.36 cars. In downtown Evanston, a typical household owns 1.15 cars." Now, that's census tract based, yes?
That is correct.
Okay, and that wouldn't matter, occupancy wouldn't make any difference?
No.
That's people in cars?
That, you are correct.
Okay. I mean, it seems to me that that's, and I'll come back to why I think that's important. Let me stop here and ask the two ladies who have come in since we began. Do you wish to testify on either of the items that is before us this evening? Either an ordinance regarding parking requirements near transit stops, or how we define front yards?
No, our purpose here today, we are observing how the committee is run and do things, so, and convince her that she should apply to be on one of the committees.
Ah, okay, fine.
And I haven't studied that, the department I looked at and say, I'm not too sure about that.
Okay.
But no, I don't have no question for it tonight.
Okay, well, we welcome you here as observers. Okay, let's see. Commissioner Pagozzi.
No, I think this is a step in the right direction. I mean, I might be a minority point of view, but I think it's very modest. I could see it stretching a little further in the reduction in the transit-oriented areas. I think most of the projects that we have come before us, due to the water table and soil conditions in Evanston, there's a natural. It's just not economically feasible to comply with the literal letter of the current parking requirements. So it's definitely in the right direction. I would personally push it even further. I think Evanston has a pretty robust public transportation system, much more so than some of the other comparables that were provided. And I, based on everything I've read, and the trend is, the get off my lawn generation is fading away, and I think that people are going to own fewer and fewer vehicles as the younger millennials kind of start earning more dough. Of course, that could change. Who knows? But I think any structure or revision that we can provide in our zoning ordinance that gives potential developers more structure and understanding on in terms of what the rules are before they make a huge investment to build a project with 100 units, which is a big project. We don't see that many projects that have 100 units in them. And again, the issue of having this body or the council adding sidewalk width inches and other entitlements that they may want to negotiate with is still there because it's a PUD. Any project of that size it's automatically going to be a PUD. We're just not set up to accommodate projects of that magnitude without that being the case. So I'm supportive of it. I appreciate the hard work that went into this. I think it's a step in the right direction. Thanks.
Thank you. I still have a light on over here.
Yeah, I do still have more questions.
Welcome, Commissioner Saul. Did you get your car fixed?
Tire's all good, thank you.
Hopefully a quick one here. This study was completed when we had one more car share operator than we have now. Does that make any difference?
I don't see if that would make too much of a difference.
I don't know if the remaining one has approached the city and taken those spots over at all, or if that makes any difference?
Not to my knowledge.
Okay.
Yeah.
And maybe a more relevant question here. When I look at the graph and the chart that's on the screen, do we have to either take 0.55 per bedroom for any size, or can it be, could we say studios has got to be 1 and then the other one's is 0.55? Is it either 0.55 across the board or 1 across the board per unit?
For the way it's described here, and if it's not clear, I apologize, the 1 parking space per unit was what was initially proposed.
Mm-hmm.
So that would be regardless of the number of bedrooms within the unit.
Okay.
The 0.55, that deals with just studios and 1 bedroom. So if you have a building that's all studios and 1 bedrooms, it would be 0.55 per unit. As we go to 2 bedrooms and then 3 bedrooms, it increases to 1.1 for 2 bedrooms or 1.65 for 3 bedrooms. So that would be per unit that has that particular number of bedrooms.
No, I understand that. My question is more, does the recommendation has to be either 0.55 per bedroom, including studios, or can we say for studios it's got to be 1, and for the other ones, other sizes, 0.55 per bedroom? Or does it have to be only one number be specified?
Well, our recommendation is just for either or. If it's preferred by the commission, you can suggest a change.
I'm not suggesting a change. I just want to know if I have to pick only one of the 2. And that seems to be no.
I understood that the 0.55, 1.1, 1.65 was your recommendation, and that 1 was a fallback.
That was indeed the case.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you. There's a piece of information that if we go on, if we don't finish tonight, I'd love to have somebody compile for us. And if we do finish tonight, I think it might be useful in your presentation to the council. On page 8 of the consultant's report, we have a list of developments which we have recently approved. In each of those, we have granted a variance for parking spaces. But we have, in those cases, identified the number of spaces per unit. And so the question I can't answer based on this information is, would those units, would those projects have fallen within the new rules if they had been in force by right, or would we have had to grant additional variances to get them down to these numbers, which would require converting dwelling units into bedrooms in those developments? I think that would be a really helpful piece of information. Let me make just a more general statement here. We've talked a lot, and you talk a good deal in the report about the issue of managing demand. There are a couple of cases in which the report suggests that one of our strategies here may be to limit the supply in order to encourage a reduction in demand. Sort of a, if we don't build it, they won't come approach, with which I am uncomfortable. It seems to me that the better argument to make in support of this proposal, and I will say that I like the proposal, it seems to me that the better argument is that demand is already demographically taking care of itself, and that what we're doing is encouraging an oversupply, and that the oversupply is not a good allocation of resources. The developer money and to some extent public money could be used in better ways than providing parking that we don't need. And it seems to me that part of making that argument is to say, our experience is that in these projects that have already been built, the demand was in fact already low enough that we could reduce supply without a negative effect. You see what I'm saying? I still have a light on. Commissioner Isaac.
Yeah, I had the same question you had regarding that table, and I calculated it for 3 of them just while we were sitting here, and they'd be closer, but they still would have had to come here and ask us for a reduction.
A reduction?
Yeah.
Oh, that's
That's
too
just
bad.
3 out of the 12 that are on there.
That's too bad.
And then that would also mean that if we were to go with this proposal, the variance requests would look a lot smaller because we're making the baseline number lower.
Yes.
Yeah, and just to update those numbers a little bit on the newer developments there, it's about half and half. So Chicago and Maine project, 835 Chicago, is at 0.76 vehicles per bedroom, so it would be over. 1620 Central is 0.59, so it would be over. 1571 Maple.
Well, that's a weird one because
Right.
we're providing that off-site.
Right, including them off-site would be at 0.75.
Okay.
So it'd be over. However, the Noise project would have been 0.47, so it would be less, and the 831 Emerson would have been 0.43 per bedroom, so it would have been less. So kind of a split there.
Okay. I mean, I must say, and I've said this to staff, this issue won't confront me because by the time this ordinance is adopted and becomes useful, I will be gone. But if we were to adopt these changes, I would be tempted to become a real hard-nose on the subject of variances. If we're making a serious move in the direction of reducing what we require of developers, then I'm going to look a good deal harder at a developer who comes in and says, well, no, I need still more.
Or I want to
But
build
I-
less
but-
parking.
But I won't be here, so the rest of you get to cope with that issue. Well, yeah, I want to build still less parking. Right. Commissioner Pugozzi.
Yeah, I would just say to that, it's still a modest reduction. I mean, if you really wanted to, this could be pushed even further. I don't, it really is a very targeted area, and it's justified by the access to transportation, the immediate access to transportation. Where other cities, they also count in bus routes and within 15-minute walk times to a station. So it at least every case is different. Every project has a different nuance to it. If they come in with a PD, they're inevitably going to have other asks, that whether it's an increase in height, whether it's an increase in FAR or whatever.
Of course.
I think it at least gives people, the baseline is at least more reasonable, so that there is a shot that someone could actually do more serious analysis in trying to meet the requirement. Who knows? If who knows who will be sitting here, who will be on the council, and how what the economy will be.
Sure.
But again, every project that I've seen come before us has always asked for a parking reduction, and all of them are slightly different in that there's a combination of sharing space in the public garages. They're all a little bit different. So I don't. I see, again, these things ordinances are living documents. They evolve. They I think this is a good reaction. It's probably a little late. From what I've seen, the people I've talked to, I think the housing boom might be slowing down, or at least the new projects will. The cranes you see are, 4 years old, in the making, so it doesn't. I know that there are some other big proposals out there, but, we'll see if they actually come to fruition. Again, I'm going to support this. I would even be more aggressive in it. But that's just me.
I have a question just about what your opinion is on whether developers will have a larger ask for density now that there's a lower parking requirement. They won't be trying to reach for that parking or reach for the parking requirement and thereby reduce the number of units. And so now they're going to come in with more units than what they would have otherwise approved. And of course, it'll be within our power to say, it's too dense or not, but I think the reaction will be, well, I can build more units below a height because, we tend to be focused on how high is this building going to be, and they'll just put more units in that same number of floors. I don't know that it matters. Just wanted to know what you thought about that.
I think it's possible. I think there's a saturation point in the market, or a limit to how small or how dense you can make a property. I don't know what that is, but there are other regs that you pointed out to that kind of put caps on that. I think, the immediate trade-off is that they would try to get more units in a given parcel, whatever that might be, as opposed to giving that to parking. They might give it more to landscaped areas. They might provide wider sidewalk streetscapes, which seems to be really important. I didn't know there was such expertise out there, but that's good. If that's what's important. And I also think maybe there's a chance I think it depends on the quality of the proposed development. That's a factor in there too. Who is what the reputation is of the builder, the architect, and what the project is actually proposing. There's all kinds of variables out there. So, I don't think a higher density is such a bad thing. Some of the most valuable property in the world is pretty dense. So, it's not a bad trend. I'm not saying we build skyscrapers everywhere, but it does have a benefit having density located in certain areas. So
I hadn't thought about this, but if I remember correctly, when we were dealing with 1571 Maple, there's a provision in the code that in calculating the maximum height of a building, or the number of floors, I forget which, you get what amounts to an allowance for floors of parking. Somehow, this change would change that calculation. I'm not sure how, but you presumably, for the number of units up there, you're going to need fewer floors worth of parking, which effectively knocks down the bonus you can get, doesn't it? I don't think that's a showstopper, but Commissioner Browell, your light.
Yes. Maybe just a point to remind everybody that is interested in this. I feel like the most recent plan developments that we approved or that have been approved were in areas where residents of those buildings were not going to be allowed to get street parking. So and that seems to be a trend that will continue, and therefore making changes to this should not have a huge impact on street parking because they're already not allowed to do it. Just a point to be on the record about it.
Well, but that's why I would want as good information as we can get on existing car ownership patterns, because I think one of the arguments you're going to run into is that if you reduce the number of units without reducing the supply of cars, then those cars are going to bubble out into the street, which is what nobody wants. And so I think it's essential to begin with the fact that car ownership is going down, that we are not creating a change in demand here, we are responding to it, to an existing change in demand. I think that's a critical part of the argument.
Would wheel tax data be available and useful for that? Because you have to register it at your address.
Yeah, that information would definitely be useful. We also got information from the Secretary of State with regards to vehicle ownership, and that goes by address as well. So we were able so we were able to see essentially how many vehicles were owned in a particular development.
Then how can we achieve what what Chairman Ford is asking? What data do we need? Or it's just a different way of presenting the data?
No, I think it's a matter of how you pitch it.
Yeah.
Among the other, are there comments that we want to make on the other recommendations beyond the change in the parking requirement? Is there anything else there we want to comment on? We've commented on the TDM study, we've commented on request for variances.
Could we just have those back on the screen, please? Thank you.
The fourth bullet point, require multimodal transportation study for all developments. Is that, we're just saying planned developments? Or is that like if you want any new construction building permit within?
Right, that would be for new developments.
Whether or not you were required to get planned development approval?
For planned developments, that would be.
Just planned developments, okay.
You know, that should be clarified.
Yeah.
Kind of reads the other way around right now.
Yeah.
I'd like to make a comment on the last bullet point of the major recommendations. And I know it's one of the more far-fetched and really kind of last resort thing, but the fee in lieu thing just opens up a lot of wasted time, and I think there's much better ways of achieving what we're trying to achieve.
You know, what's the idea here? That you would allow somebody to pay into a parking capital fund in place of providing parking spaces?
Hi,
Hi, Jane Wilberding with Sam Schwartz Engineering. So the fee in lieu is an option for developers who can, exactly what you said, buy into, instead of providing that parking space, pay for the space for a fee, and that would go into the city's fund, which has, in other case studies across the country, gone into beautification efforts, streetscape efforts, and reduced the demand, as well as kind of made the area more vibrant. That's the reasoning behind that.
Anybody want to comment on that?
The risk of being too blunt, it's an easy cop-out for a developer.
No, go ahead and be blunt.
It is an easy cop-out for
Yeah,
a developer.
the phrase "dead on arrival" was going through my mind. That's going to. Yeah, I would take it out. Anybody want to think it's a good idea?
Well, I think it could be a good idea as long as those funds are targeted toward streetscape improvements. You know, I think it depends on how it's used, or, I mean, if it's potentially just goes into the big coffer and we spend it on ice rink arena studies, I mean, then maybe I'd feel differently about that, but.
Yeah, but the question that I ask is, then I'm building a 50-unit building, and I'm required to provide 50 parking spaces, and instead I provide 25 and I pay into the fee. Where are the other 25 cars going to go? I mean, it seems to me that this is precisely where we get into the problem that we have run into with the council on a bunch of projects like this, where the fear is that if we lower the parking requirement, we're just dumping cars out onto the street, and then all the neighbors get upset. And it seems to me that this plays right into that concern. I think this one. I'm afraid that if you put this in front of the council, that point is going to get read, and the rest of it may go down.
Wouldn't, I hope, that if there was a way to buy your way out of the parking requirement, you would still have to prove that whatever you're asking for is sufficient for the development. So if someone wants to reduce it by half, they would still have to produce a report. They can just say, I'm supposed to do 50, I want to do 25, here's my check. And here's also a study that shows that 25 is sufficient for this development.
Well, then why wouldn't we just grant the variance to 25?
And I'm not advocating for that provision. I'm just saying if it's in there, it should still be supported by some evidence. It shouldn't just be, I want 0, so I'm going to give you a check for 50 times whatever the fee is.
If you made it mandatory, then, oh, sorry, please.
Could we, instead of a general fee in lieu of, say, a fee that goes directly into a parking fund to build more parking?
I do believe that was a discussion that we did have, where if we started to receive a significant amount of fees in lieu or some kind of fee associated with reduced parking, that we could do the long-term parking study or a comprehensive parking study, or put that towards improving the amount of parking that we have through the city. So that was an idea that was talked about briefly. I definitely understand the concern of accepting additional fees without having a place for them to go. Yeah, because that's a kind of similar to the concern that has been brought up with the inclusionary housing ordinance and how to use those funds. So I do understand the concern that way. This was just another option to see if there are ways we could provide additional parking, whether it be an additional garage, which I don't know that Ricky Voss would be all that excited for, but to also possibly do additional studies or do some improvements to existing parking structures and things like that.
Could we move that bullet point below the line? Could we make it a long-term consideration rather than a major consideration? Leave it up there, but sort of take it out of the line of fire.
You can do that. That's reasonable.
I will just say it's fine if it goes below the line. I don't actually like the provision. It seems weird that in a TOD, where part of the point is to reduce the dependence on cars, people have to pay for doing just that. So I would personally just take it out, but I'm also okay with it being a long-term, on-the-shelf type thing.
Okay, maybe we come back to that when we get to the point of, if we get to framing a motion. Are there further questions or comments on any of this?
One question for has the, since I'm not going to be parking to get batteries at Radio Shack anytime soon, then I'm wondering, and that's kind of a joke about, I see a lot of vacancies in the retail stores in downtown. Maybe Target's going to improve that, I don't know. But, it seems like the trend is the golden age of retail is probably over. And I don't know what the future is for some of those stores. I don't know if it'll come back. I don't know if it's going to be something different. But nonetheless, did your study have any? Did it consider the reduction in demand for retail parking in Evanston at all, or was that just not part of it?
No, we did not. We only looked at parking spaces that were reserved for residential.
For residential, okay.
So no ups or downs in retail should affect our data, but also, it doesn't play into any of the recommendations that we had made. Maybe there's excess parking from the retail perspective that can be accommodating residential also. That would be something that would be a much more comprehensive scope than what we looked at. We were only looking at residential demand.
Okay, thanks.
I mean, we've certainly had a couple of projects where the question arose whether there could be day-night use of spaces. The project at Maine and Chicago, I think, was one of those. Presumably, if you got into doing the full parking study, you might look at that question. Yes.
The one by Ryan Field is a real obvious one. I mean, that you have that huge lot that gets filled up for only football games, and
It's filled up every day.
Well, it's North Shore Hospital.
Oh, yes.
That's
yeah.
where
It is
people
filled
park that work in a
every day,
hospital.
yes.
whoa,
Oh,
okay, didn't
that's
know
a-
that.
Yeah, that's a permitted
Sorry.
lot.
Man.
Okay, if there's no further oh, sorry.
Right here.
Yes, ma'am.
I have a question.
Come on up to the microphone, if you would, and tell us your name.
I'm sorry.
That's all right.
My name is Betty Esther. In listening to your presentation, and this is for the transit-oriented development parking, and looking at what has been developed around the train stations already, is there a limit out to, for, say, from the L station, is there a distance out from them that is included in that? Say, like say from Davis Street, what cuts off your area for a transit station, because you can go out too far and you're getting into the neighborhood. And so most of if you look at the development around the different stations, most of that has already have developments that have occurred, and anything that occur after that is kind of moving into the neighborhood. And the other thing is, will this only be for the transit-oriented area, or will it apply to development that they would be building in, say, the R5, which says you can do a 5-story building, and have 16 or more units in that building? Will this fall into that area when they're looking at parking, or will we use the parking for that? Because if you do it, if it's not set for the transit area, then the people in the neighborhood is fighting for parking and stuff. So if you could put something in there that says this is strictly for this area and not the other part. But also, how far does the transit development area go out?
The city has adopted, actually with the inclusionary housing ordinance, there were maps that were created. So typically, what is considered a transit-oriented development area is within 1/8 of a mile or 1/4 of a mile from the transit station. So that would be the areas that we are looking at. It would not go beyond that into the more residential areas. So, for example.
And outside of those areas, the existing rules would apply.
Right.
Yeah, thank you, Ms. Esther. That's a good question. Okay. What's your pleasure, folks? Does somebody want to move approval of the recommendation as it has been presented to us by staff?
Well, we haven't decided if it's 1 or 55, we have 2 options.
Okay, pick an option and make a motion.
Before we get to a motion, if we were to have motion and approve it and approve one of the 2 numbers, with, I'm pretty sure, the change on the recommendation part of it, can we still ask for the extra information that you, Chairman, were asking about, so that council has a little more to work with when it goes to council? Even if we approve it, can we ask for more information?
Oh, yeah, yeah.
All right.
All right, I will entertain a motion to approve the staff's recommendation, including the numbers .55, 1.1, and 1.65. Anybody want to make that motion?
I so move.
Isaac, is there a second? Bogotsi. Now, does anybody want to offer an amendment to that motion to strike the bullet point, consider establishing and implementing an impact fee? Commissioner Saul.
Yep.
Commissioner Saul moves an amendment to strike the, whatever it is, 7th bullet point. Is there a second to that?
Second.
Yeah.
Okay. Commissioner Dubin. On the amendment, we'll do this by voice.
We have some discussion.
Okay, go ahead. Discussion on that.
I just would like some information on why you chose the .55, the fractions.
Can we deal with the issue of, let us get the issue of the impact fee out of the way, then we can come back to the numbers. Okay. All right, on the question of the impact fee, the motion is to amend by striking that bullet point. Discussion on that motion.
And do we need a separate to move it to the long term, or do we just want to strike it completely right now?
Well, the motion is to strike it.
Okay.
If that motion fails, we can try an amendment to
I'm
move
in favor
it.
of striking it, personally.
All right. All in favor of striking it, say aye. Opposed?
Nay.
Um,
2 nays. Motion passes.
2 nays, yeah, the motion passes, the chairman votes aye. All right. Now then, we're at the main motion again, and Carol, you had a question about how we got to the numbers.
Why was the decision made to choose a fractional ownership for a car as opposed to just one per unit?
Well, the existing,
Not you, the person who made the motion. I'm asking, I live in a community building, and it seems to me that one per unit is a more equitable way to state this.
But by putting the fraction at 0.55, that doesn't mean
Yeah, I know, I
that, but if a building is 20 studios and 21 bedrooms, you get 40 times 0.55, but if you don't need it, you don't use it, and
Yeah,
that's. If I may add to that since we're trending towards smaller units, keeping a studio in a one bedroom at 1 per unit, it means quite a bit of parking, and it's a significant difference because it's almost 2 to 1. And we're going towards, especially in TOD areas, smaller units.
I think the fractions also just allow more weighting. So even if the trend right now is smaller units, if for some reason it's shifted and there are more 2s and 3s, it allows more parking. Whereas if it's just 1 per unit, then it doesn't really matter the size of the unit. So if there's 3 bedrooms, they still get 1, but you might need a few more. So
Yeah.
I think it makes sense to me.
So that how it balances out depends on the balance on the distribution of units within the building. Yeah. Okay, other comments or questions? All right, then, on the motion to approve the staff recommendation with the fractional amounts, we're going to the council, so let's do a roll call.
Is this going to the council, or is this going back to?
Well, if the motion is to recommend approval, so it would go to Planning and Development Committee. Now, we're asking that it go with additional information. Do you want it to come back to us with more information before we send it?
No. No, thank you.
Can I, just to be clear, what is the additional information? Is it additional information or crafting of the message? It just wasn't clear to me what.
I took it principally to be crafting the message, although I did also ask for a recalculation of the buildings that we have approved so that we can show how those line up. And I'd want to see a table that shows how those line up with the ordinance as it's being presented. I mean, I think the argument that needs to be made here is this is not ridiculous. This, in fact, matches reality.
We're voting on a motion for recommendations on draft text amendments that will ultimately come back to us for approval. Right? We're not voting on text amendments today. Otherwise, we'd have the actual sections of the ordinance that are going to be modified, have the actual language. We don't have that in front of us. We have these recommendations. It seems to me that, and maybe staff can chime in, staff, you're looking for direction from us as to how to, or like what in the zoning ordinance to modify to address these, address the report that's included.
Actually, ideally, if you're comfortable, if the commission's comfortable with it, it'd be a recommendation to bring a text amendment to the city council or the planning development committee and then the city council. I guess we feel that the changes are essentially changing the numbers as opposed to large sections of code or text in there. So if you're comfortable with staff working with the law department and creating those text amendments, we would then bring those forward to the Planning Development Committee just to change that parking requirement.
I mean, the .55 is pretty straightforward, and I think a few of these bullet points are pretty straightforward, and that makes sense. But some of them are, I've lost my page. If you could go, some of them are like encourage.
Yeah, and to clarify, the text amendment would only do with the parking requirements, the .55.
Okay.
And then the additional changes in the report, that's something that we could make as well for the planning development, but it's not proposed that those go into an ordinance at this point.
No, those are essentially administrative changes, aren't they not?
Correct, so those would be policies.
So that the other bullet points, the 4 that are, or 5 that are still there, are things that you would do by administrative action in order to implement a change in the numbers in the zoning ordinance. Is that correct?
Yes, yes. It would be something we'd require of the developer, ask of the developer when they submit their plan development application, essentially, and in what situation they'd have the TDM plan.
But again, like, if it's not in the ordinance, this, require multimodal transportation study for all developments. If it's not in the ordinance, then it would still be a strong recommendation by staff, right? I mean, we're not writing that into the ordinance by this vote, or like we're not asking that the city council recommend to the city council that it be written into the ordinance by this vote. Or are we? I mean, I want to be clear what we're voting on exactly. The .55, that's straightforward, and I agree. It should just be presented to the city council as a text amendment. But some of this other stuff, like, I guess, are those going to be parts of the text amendment provided to the city council, or is it, as Chairman Ford had indicated, that it's just going to be part of what you're going to be doing internally as staff in recommending what direction a developer takes when putting together a proposal?
The latter. It would not be a text amendment to the zoning ordinance.
Yeah, so, I mean, I can imagine you saying to the council, we want to establish by ordinance these numbers as the parking requirements that we will enforce. If you approve those, then it is our intent administratively to take the following steps, which will put those, which will I thought I knew what I was going to say, sort of enable us to administer those numbers.
Yeah, I think this
didn't come out anywhere
mostly
nearly as
is additional
clearly as I
information
thought
that
it
would be asking for an applicant when they're coming in for plan development. And so it'd be, the city council has made this, and the plan commission's made this recommendation and this policy, that this project, you submit a transportation demand management plan. If you wanted it in the future to be in the code and in the text of the ordinance, we could look at that further. We're kind of not that far along to, we do have sections of the code, just offhand that deal with submission requirements, so it potentially could go in there. But we're comfortable with it just being a recommendation of the Plan Commission and City Council at this point.
Okay.
You sure?
I'm just interested to see how it's going to be presented to the city council. I mean, because
I
by
guess
having this discussion, the staff knows what, in general terms, what at least our position is on the bullet points. But is the city council really going to vote on something that's not going to be part of the ordinance, but rather just be recommendations to staff on how to, what I'm asking really is more procedural than substantive, right? But it's really getting to the heart of whether these other bullet points are going to be substantive changes to the zoning ordinance or not. And it sounds to me like you're saying, no, the major change you're making, or the only change you're making to the zoning, the text of the zoning ordinance, is the reduction to the 0.55 ratio.
That is the intent, yes.
Okay.
Yeah, and that if you present these to council, they are presented as ways of making this thing work. Well, if we're comfortable, I'm going to call for a roll call. Okay, roll call.
All right. Commissioner Bilal?
Aye.
Commissioner Dubin?
Aye.
Commissioner Goddard?
Aye.
Commissioner Isaac?
Aye.
Commissioner Pagotzi? Commissioner Saul?
Aye.
Chair Ford?
Aye. The vote is unanimous. The recommendation will go forward to council. I think this is a really important one, and if we can do anything to help with council, let us know. Thank you all for your time and your efforts. Okay. Then let's go back. Let's find our papers. All right. Case number 17 PLND 0030, a zoning text amendment to codify staff authority to determine the front yard of a corner lot. Ms. Jones.
Okay. I believe everyone was here for that meeting. At the May 10th meeting, we brought a proposed text amendment to shift the authority of determining the front lot line for a corner lot or a through lot solely from the owner of the property to the zoning administrator. Currently, the regulations are as listed above. The actual definition for the front lot line says it's determined by the property owner. What we brought to the commission in May solely shifted that authority to the zoning administrator and gave some fairly broad conditions that would be considered when determining where that front lot line was. So over the course of discussion, commission voiced concerns regarding those determining factors that were brought up, essentially circling around the fact that they were a little bit too broad and gave the zoning administrator almost too much authority in determining where the front lot line was and making that particular decision. So we went back and did some additional research on how some neighboring communities actually made that determination, as well as consulted the planner's definition that's provided by the APA, and have come up with a revised proposal as listed here. It would essentially stay the same, but we would add the section at the end that says the zoning administrator has the authority to determine the front lot line for a corner lot, giving consideration including but not limited to the following. A, if the building exists on the lot, previous determination of the front yard, conformance to existing required setbacks, existing principal building orientation and location of building entrances. B, proportions of the lot line dimensions, with preference for the front lot line being the shorter lot line abutting a street. C, pattern of existing development within the neighborhood, specifically of adjacent lots, and D, the property owner's expressed desire. So we did consult with our legal department on some of the language there, and we have added a greater consideration of the owner's expressed desire for that particular determination. And then the change to the definition would stay the same as what was previously proposed.
Okay, keep going.
So for the standards for the text amendment, we have the same four. Whether the proposed amendment is consistent with the goals, objectives, and policies of the Comprehensive General Plan as adopted and amended from time to time by the City Council. Whether the proposed amendment is compatible with the overall character of existing development in the immediate vicinity of the subject property. Whether the proposed amendment will have an adverse effect on the value of adjacent properties and the adequacy of public facilities and services. Just a brief overview.
Am I correct? Yeah, I've got the draft ordinance. So the definition would remain lot line, front, a lot line, a street lot line, any street lot line of a corner lot may be established by the zoning administrator as a front lot line, but you are also including in the language of the ordinance those four matters to which the administrator must consider in making the determination.
Exactly.
Okay. Am I correct, do I remember correctly our discussion first, that this came to us by aldermanic reference, and that the alderman's concern was not for, nor not primarily for, a residential lot, but for a commercial lot abutting a residential area?
Do you believe, yeah, that was the sticking point for that conversation?
Okay. Questions and comments on the staff's revised proposal? Commissioner Belisle.
More of a maybe recommendation in the packet from the examples in other cities. We had illustrations. I think that would help a lot at presentation to City Council, just to make people understand what really we're trying to do. Because I found those really helpful looking to comparable cities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Commissioner Isaac.
Two questions. One, I believe there's a process by which a property owner or a prospective purchaser of a property can go to the zoning administrator and get a zoning certification. Does that mean that the form or what the zoning administrator will now have to opine to is where the front lot line is?
Not sure I fully understand what you're asking, but for different properties, if they're proposing a particular project, the owner or developer, whoever is proposing that, does have to obtain a zoning analysis. And as a part of that zoning analysis, they deal with determining proper setbacks and things of that nature. So over the course of that discussion and that analysis, they would have to determine where the front lot line is, because that determines front yard, side yard, and rear yard setbacks. And so these considerations would have to be brought up over the course of that particular analysis. I'm not sure if that answers your question.
This affects all corner lots, and someone who's buying a house, and let's say, they're just going to go in and get a zoning analysis and figure out whether it's non-conforming or whether it's whether it's built within the current rules. They come and ask for a zoning certification, which I believe the zoning administrator is required to provide upon payment of a fee. if we're letting the zoning administrator determine what the front lot line is, wouldn't the zoning administrator have to wouldn't they have to opine as to what it is and say, I'm certifying to you this is the front lot line? And if that's the case, then I presume that under this, 4A, that they'd subsequently be precluded, at least as it relates to the current structure, to say that it isn't.
This is, we're talking here not for a development, but for a transfer of ownership.
Correct. I mean, anything.
Okay.
I mean, even if it's a transfer of ownership for a property that's subsequently going to be developed. I mean, it seems to me like if someone asks for a zoning certification and they get it and they say, and the zoning administrator says, this is the front lot line, before any development is made, before any proposals made, that someone may not want to, I mean, right now, an owner has the right to determine which one's going to be the front. So they don't have to do that due diligence before they purchase because it's well within their rights, right? But by putting it in the zoning administrator's hands, now, if you're going to be buying a commercial lot, even a residential lot, and you're planning on developing it, you're going to want to know before you close where the front lot line is and what you're going to be able to fit in where and how you're going to figure it out. Because a lot of times people, developers aren't going to buy unless they know what they can build, at least at a minimum. And if you provide a certification saying that this is where the front lot line is, you can't turn around and change it because you don't like what they're ultimately developing. Because you've provided, as part of what the zoning administrator does, is he provides that certification.
I have just a question of clarification to
Wait a minute.
add to that.
Yeah, okay. I've got you in line, but does staff want to respond to Commissioner Isaacs? Or do you want to respond?
No, I don't. But I think it's tied, because what I recall, I think I asked this at the May meeting, is whether this applied to existing properties and owners. So it's not like you're grandfathered in, right? It applies to all properties regardless of when. That's what I recall from the last meeting. It's not clear. So if I think today this is my front yard line, you could, if this is passed, say, actually, no, this is.
Correct. It would apply to all properties. The first consideration is in there. A is specifically regarding if a building exists on the lot. The consideration would be the previous determination of the front yard, essentially how the lot's laid out, conformance to the existing required setback. So if you have 30 feet on one side, it complies with the rear setback. You have 15 on the street side, complies with the street side setback. The existing principal building orientation, location building entrances. So that language is in there to relate to existing lots.
So it could change for anybody, whether I'm about to buy a house or whether I'm in the house already.
It'd be based on how it's set up. So if you're set up, you've got 27 feet on one side and 15 on the other side, then it would be judged the 27-foot side based on the existing layout would be the front yard. And the 15 side would be the side yard because those conform with the setbacks, existing orientation of the building. So it would essentially stay status quo.
I have another question, but I'll let
So
this conversation finish.
let's say I had a property and the two street sides were equal in length. The house was perfectly symmetrical, had entrances on both sides. But that at one time in the past, I had installed an air conditioner on the north side of the house, which is a side yard amenity. If I came in then and asked for a generator on the west side, the ruling would have to be, no, you already established that the north side was the side yard when you built the air conditioner. When we approved it, that became your side yard. Therefore, the other is, by default, the front yard, and you can't put the compressor there. Yes?
that sounds reasonable in the hypothetical without seeing something on paper.
Okay.
But yes.
Another question I asked last time, I still don't understand what we're trying to address and what we're trying to solve by this ordinance. It seems like someone's going to be, who's currently using a front as a side or whatever, is going to be affected by this. But I still don't understand the larger issue that we're trying to address here, which makes it hard for me to vote either way.
Sure. To address a little bit, one, it came from aldermanic reference. Two, I think it's basically lining up with existing practices as far as how things are determined. If there's a house that faces front door facing one street with a 27-foot setback set up exactly how it's a front yard, they would not be allowed to put a 6-foot fence on that side. They would be allowed to put a 6-foot fence on the side that's set up as a side property of the house with a 15-foot setback, et cetera.
So, I'm sorry.
Just so hopefully it's short. So if someone had a 6-foot fence that you viewed problematic, they could potentially be forced to remove it on
Any existing compliant, would be legal non-conforming even if it were in this case. So
Okay, that's
no, this
not-
would not
Okay, that's not, I don't know
Make
if that
someone
would be the
change
place
the
to
setback
address
of their
it, but that's
house
not
or
clear
anything like that.
if there's an existing condition that's not affected by this ordinance.
Commissioner Belisle.
I just want to say that it's the level of deference to the existing conditions seems to be higher in the way you're describing it, talking about it, than the way it is written in there. I don't know if I'm the only one that sees that, but
The intent was based on the discussion last time that if a building exists on the lot, previous determination of front yard, so not changing something that's already been determined to be a front yard, the conformance of existing required setbacks of where the building's oriented on the site to conform with the front yard or street side yard setbacks, the existing principal building orientation, so it's facing one direction versus facing the other direction, how it's already set up, and the location of building entrances. So those those were the modifications made to try to address those concerns.
Those are the existing conditions, essentially.
Correct.
Yeah. As precisely as you could think of them.
Right, without going through every
Okay.
single
Yeah.
lot
Okay.
and circumstance, yes.
So how does a developer get certainty? How does someone who's purchasing property get certainty that this is where the front yard is and this is where the side yard is? It's a vacant lot. I want to purchase it. What are you going to build? I don't know, but I want to know where the front yard is and where the side yard is. Where is it?
Typically, would be a zoning analysis, so the procedure that Megan describes, the kind of your first step in developing anything, and then you'd have some sort of plan that you'd come with, a site plan,
But
might not be elevations.
This
might
doesn't
be-
require that, right? I mean, you're not
You can
required.
buy property without a ability to develop it or, a plan to develop it, certainly. But if you want to develop in a certain way, you'd come in for the zoning analysis to see whether that development meets codes and whether it's compliant or non-compliant, which would be the result of the zoning analysis.
I don't like
So-
the fact. I don't like the fact that someone can't get certainty earlier in the process.
Well, the issue would only arise, the need to know which was the front yard wouldn't arise before you knew what you were going to do on it. Why would you care which was the front yard if you didn't know what you were going to do?
You don't always know exactly what is going to go on the property
No.
when you buy it,
Right.
but you may want certainty as to whether it's an R3, whether it's R4.
Well, that you can,
Right, I mean.
okay, that you get certainty on.
Okay, why can't you get certainty on where the front yard is and where the setbacks are going to be? If you can get certainty on one, why can't you get certainty on the
Well,
other?
you could ask. I mean, I'm looking at my next door neighbor. And interestingly enough, well, I look at the pattern of existing development, the third provision. He's on a corner lot. On one side, he has my house. On the other side, he has an alley. it seems to me that that would move you in the direction of saying that his front yard matches up with my front yard, the pattern of existing development. So that I would guess that in a lot of cases, the zoning administrator could go ahead. I wonder what percentage of these decisions are not no-brainers. I guess that's what I'm wondering, if you take vacant lots. Are no-brainers? Yeah, I would think so.
I think in most instances, when you purchase a property, the address is usually has an address, and that address is associated with the street, and that's your front yard. And I don't want to guess anymore because I was way off on the parking lot by Ryan Field, but I'm going to guess in most cases, the majority of cases, it's pretty obvious what that front yard is. Now, if you are buying a vacant lot or you have a corner lot and you want to do something creative, I don't see anything wrong with being able to have a conversation with the zoning administrator who doesn't want to get in hot water with his alderman or anybody else for that matter, who is going to look at these facts, considering all these written, A through D, and if there's a strong case to say, it's reasonable to make this the front yard as opposed to something that might have, where it was always assumed to be, I don't have a problem with that. I mean, I think I have faith in the zoning administration officials that they would be able to help a owner make that determination and not violate the harmony of the surrounding area. So I think it just seems like this is kind of getting a lot more hypothetical, and we're kind of getting wound up about what could happen. But in reality, maybe someone would present a situation where it would be awful, but I don't see a lot of harm in giving them that flexibility without forcing the guy to have to go, forcing someone. I think it's easier for a developer or potential owner having that flexibility without, oh man, instead of having a conversation with the city official, now I have to go through a zoning ordinance change. And that's even scarier. Anyway, that's how I feel.
I think previous determinations of front yard conformance shouldn't be just a consideration. I think it should be conclusive. If the zoning administrator makes the decision that this is where the front yard is, someone should be able to rely on that, I guess is my point.
But it sounds to me as though you're also suggesting that the zoning administrator has to make a determination of what the front yard is before there's necessarily a development proposal. I would agree with you that once the zoning administrator has said, this is the front yard, that's the front yard. But the question is whether you have to even ask that question before the issue of setbacks becomes relevant, and setbacks become relevant only when you determine what you're going to put on the property. Right?
So walk me through the process. Zoning, someone comes in and wants to build a house on a lot.
On a vacant lot.
They have a vacant lot. Let's for purposes of this conversation, let's say it's a vacant lot. They come in with plans. They come in with architectural plans and say we want a zoning analysis. And then all of a sudden the administrator says, sorry, you've put the front yard in the wrong place. You got to switch it. And they've paid for the architectural plans already.
Yeah, if you have a decent architect, they will have figured that out.
No, but the zoning administrator has the authority to decide where it's going to be. I mean,
It's not in the zoning administrator's interest to do that, because then you're going to get in legal trouble with what we have right there.
And it also says based on the owner's desires, or taking into account the property owner's expressed desire.
the zoning administrator would also have a conversation with that property owner about what would be the best course of action for a particular development. And at that point, they would learn that there would need to be a particular set of variances. And I know that our zoning staff tries to be as straightforward as possible about the possibility of certain variances being approved or denied. So, I mean, an owner could come with a set of plans that has a front yard that's not in what zoning staff would deem to be the most desirable location. But there is the variance process if an owner is adamant about moving forward. But they may or may not get that approved.
Okay.
I see Commissioner Isaac's problem. We are sort of assuming here, we're assuming two things. We're assuming that everybody's reasonable, and with the existing staff, I think we can make that assumption. But if Scott goes and hires some hard-nosed to replace Melissa, then maybe we got a problem. And we're assuming that there is always the appeals process, that one can always take this to the ZBA and get a variance. Other questions or concerns? I'm waiting to see if something comes out of the sidebar down here. Okay, all right. If not, what's your pleasure? Does somebody want to move approval of the staff's recommendation as a recommendation to council?
So move.
Let's see, let's take them in the order in which they appear. Goddard, seconded Belisle. Discussion on the motion. Let's do a roll call.
All right. Commissioner Belisle?
Aye.
Commissioner Dubin?
Aye.
Commissioner Goddard?
Aye.
Commissioner Isaac?
Nay.
Commissioner Pagotzi? Commissioner Saul?
Nay.
Chair Ford?
Aye. 5 ayes, 2 nays. The motion is approved. This will go forward to council as recommended. I think that completes the agenda. Are there any announcements, updates, progress reports, anything we need to know?
With regards to larger projects, I don't believe so. As you all are probably aware, we have gotten a plan development application for 1454 through 1508 Sherman Avenue, also known as Albion Development. That's currently under staff review, so we will be bringing that before the commission soon.
August or September?
Right.
Assuming that.
Yeah, there are other steps that need to happen before.
Right, yeah, got it. I guess I have a question. I never remember the street number, but the senior housing project on Ridge.
Ridge/Oak.
Ridge/Oak. What is the status of that?
Well, they actually did a minor adjustment to kind of switch some of the footprint of the building a little bit. They have not yet applied for a building permit, They do have a little bit of time. They requested, I believe, 18 months instead of the typical 12 months to obtain their building permit. So we're still waiting on that one.
Okay. I'm always intrigued when we sign off on something and the weeds are getting taller and taller.
Yeah. That particular developer has several different projects in the city, so I'm guessing his plate is kind of full.
Okay. Anything else? Then is there a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Dubin, seconded. Saul. All in favor? Say aye. That's why you get to second the motion. If you don't speak quickly, I get to name you. All in favor? Aye. We are adjourned. Thank you all. See you in August.